Welcome to another CS0 Intro to Programming video. In this video, I'm going to talk about use of layout managers. In previous videos, we've taken a look at border layout, we've taken a look at flow layout, but this one we're going to also take a look at box and grid layout. Okay, I'm going to run this so you can see what it looks like. Here we go. On the left, I have a bunch of labels. I've got a bunch of fields that are next to them. Down at the bottom, I've got a submit button. At the top, I've got a label that says personal data. And then I've got a text area in the center. When I look at this, I can see that I've got the border layout taking place. And in each of those areas of the border layout, I've got something. But in the east or west side of the border layout, I've got multiple things. And as you know, I can't put multiple things into the zone of a border layout. So what I need to do in this case is break it down into panels and then break those panels up into their own layouts. Let's look at the code. This is just a JFrame. There's nothing interactive about it. So Layout Managers extends JFrame. I've got a bunch of text fields. FName field, LName field, age field, height field, weight field. Then I've got a bunch of labels that correspond with those. And I've got title label as well. So we've got matching labels and fields. We've got a bunch of panels. Field panel, label panel, inputs panel, output panel, and submit panel. And those are all the panels that I'm going to use to help lay out everything in my frame. I've got a JText area called output. Text area is new, so I'm just going to briefly talk about it, and then we're going to move on. I've got a submit button. Got a field box and a label box. These are box layouts. So they're a new layout manager that I'm going to focus on this video. I do all the stuff in the main that I always do in the main. This is a basic GUI template. So I instantiate my frame, set the size, set the layout, create GUI, and set visible to true. My create GUI method, you can see, is properly decomposed. Now, we talked about decomposition in a previous video. It's the idea of breaking very complex methods down into things that are more simple. I did this to make this much, much more readable. Okay? So we've got these methods: set up labels, set up fields, set up title, set up output, and set up submit. Let's look at all that code just sort of as a quick glance. We'll sort of scroll through it. Look at how much code goes into setting these things up. That's a lot. A lot of code going into setting up our GUI. If we threw all that code in the create GUI method, the create GUI method would be really long. It'd be a pretty high level of complexity and be hard to digest in one chunk. In other words, reading through it would be really hard. You wouldn't be able to do it at a glance. You'd have to really search for things. I don't want to do that when I read other people's code, and especially if I'm going to support somebody else's code. I want to be able to look at it at a glance and be able to pick what part I need to modify. So I've got set up labels, set up fields, set up title, set up output, and set up submit. Set up labels is right here. I want to look at this one first because it uses a box layout. So I've got my label panel. It's a new J label. If we look at this, I have a J panel right here that just contains only the labels. Okay? So I've got those labels in a box layout set along the y-axis. And that's called label panel. I'm also going to have a field panel, and that's all going to be in this panel right here. And I think I called it submit panel. It should be inputs panel. All right, so label panel is a J panel. And then I've got label box, which is my box layout. I declared that as an instance variable. It gets new box layout, and then it takes in label panel and box layout dot y-axis. So there are two arguments that have to go into the box layout. First thing that it needs to take is the container that we're applying that layout manager to. Okay? Since I'm applying that to the label panel, I need to pass that into the box layout. And then box layout y-axis is the axis along which I want all of my items to align. I can either align them to the x or to the y, so vertically or horizontally. In this case, I want it to align them vertically. And what the box layout does is it makes them in a vertical stack, and it condenses them to be take up just as much space as those things are tall. So you can see that all these labels are kind of scrunched down. Next, label panel, set layout, label box. So I instantiate my panel, I create my box layout, passing my panel to it, and then I set my layout on the panel using the box layout. Okay? I think this whole process could be a little bit confusing at first. So just remember, when you make the box layout, you have to take in the container you want to apply it to, and then you set the layout to that component or container using the layout manager. The rest of this method is pretty straightforward. We're instantiating all of our labels, we're adding all of our labels to the label panel, and we're adding the label panel to the inputs panel. All right? Great. Let's take a look at setup fields. Setup fields is going to be very much the same. I'm creating a panel for the fields. It's called Fields Panel. Creating my box layout. So once again, when I instantiate the box layout, it's going to take in the panel that I'm setting this layout to. So I'm setting this box layout to my fields panel, so I have to pass the fields panel to it. Then I have to pass the axis on which this is going to be applied. So I'm applying this to the y-axis of my field panel. So all of my components that I add to the field panel will stack vertically along the y-axis of the field panel. Then I have to set the layout on my field panel using the field box. All right, so there is my setting up layout for the field panel. Then I just have to instantiate all my fields, which I do all the time. I have to add all my fields to the field panel, then add my field to the inputs box, and then I'm going to add my inputs panel to border layout west in the frames content panel. So the way I have this is the label panel gets created first, and then I have to create the field panel next. I add all the fields and all the labels to the inputs panel, and then I add the inputs panel to the frame. If I did this in a different order, if you'll notice up here in setup or create GUI, I do the labels first and then the fields next, because the fields is where I'm adding the inputs panel to the frame. So do all the labels, do all the fields, add both of those to their panel, inputs panel, and then add the inputs panel to the frame. Setup title is just going to be a title panel with a label, and then I add the label to the panel, and then add the panel to the content pane at north. Okay, because my frame is the thing that has the border layout on it. Setup output and setup submit are going to be very much the same. I'm going to have a text area in output that I'm going to add to the output panel, add the output panel to the frame, and then submit. It's just got a button that I'm adding to the submit panel, and add the submit panel to the frame as well. I want to take a look at the output panel just because it uses a text area, and then we're going to look at a class called text area basics. I must have missed it. It's up here somewhere. Here it is. So JText area. JText area is going to give me this big white box here. Now, a text area is like a text field that has multiple rows. We determine how many rows we want it to have and how many columns we want it to have. That's what we do when we instantiate. Just like a text field, we pass in an int that tells us how many characters wide it's going to be. Well, in this one, it is row first and then characters. So it's 12 rows by 25 characters in each row. All right, so that's my text area. And then I've got my output panel, which is a flow layout. I add the output text area to the output panel, and then I add the output panel to the content pane. And I need to add this to border layout center. All right, so this sets it all up, and that gives us this frame right here. Okay? Now, when I look at this frame, it's got some problems. The fields don't line up perfectly with the labels. And That's because we're using the box layouts. As I said before, the box layouts will scrunch all of the components down to take up just as much space in the panel as they need. So in this case, the labels take up less space than the fields do. So they don't line up vertically the same with the fields. So we've got to fix that. Now we can fix that using a different type of layout manager. Before we get to that layout manager, however, I just want to really quickly glance at a file for text area basics. I've got 3 text areas here. When I run it, you'll see those 3 text areas show up, sort of. I've got one text area you can barely see. It's like a little vertical line. Then I've got a text area here with some default text and a text area here that has black background with green. I want to show you just how to do those things really quickly. So I've got my 3 text areas. I do all the stuff in the main that I always do. Create GUI is where I'm going to do the text areas. So I've got my default text area here. The default text area takes nothing into the constructor, and it gives us a nothing text area. It's got no rows and no columns. You can see it as a very thin white vertical line there that we can't really interact with. Okay, I could do that, and then as soon as I start typing in it, it grows. Okay. Now here we've got a text area that is going to be 5 rows high by 15 wide. The reason I wanted to show you this file in the video is it's going to tell you how the text area is going to deal with text as it gets to the edge of the area, the issue of line wrap. We've got 2 methods here that deal with line wrap. Set line wrap, true. That's going to make it so that when you're typing and your text gets to the end of a line, it'll go down to the next line, such as this. I type, and when I get to the end of the line, it goes to the next line. Now I want to show you what the next line does. Set word or set wrap style word true. What this means is it will not break up words at the end of the line. If a word like this is too long to fit at the end of the line, it will wrap the entire word down to the next line. Like this word here is far too long to fit at the end of this line, so it wraps down to the next line. And this word here is far too long to fit on the end of this line, so it wraps down to the next line. This is just setting up the conditions for how text is going to wrap within a text area. Now if I start typing too much text in here, you're going to see that the text area will grow. It does not have scroll bars on it. All right, and the last thing is setting foreground and background is also possible. You can set the color of the foreground and the color of the background. I set the background to green, or the foreground to green and the background to black to get that green text on black screen effect. Then I add those text areas to the window. And then here, this just demonstrates how you can use the append method on a text area to add text to the end of a existing text on a text area. We'll see this in a future video. That's why I wanted to address this. All right, let's take a look at fixing this file here using another set of layout managers. This is Layout Managers Fixed. You should open that one up. When I run this, you're going to see that that side over here looks a little different. The labels and the fields now line up. They look kind of tall. It looks kind of funky. What you have to do in this case, if you're using a grid layout, which I'm using, you have to make the grid, or you have to make the GUI the right height for these. Otherwise, it's going to look kind of funny. Okay, let's take a look at the code. This one is the same thing, extends JFrame. It has basically all the same stuff as the previous video did. Most of the same panels. So it's got inputs, title, output, and submit. It's got a text area for output, a button for submit, and it's got a grid layout called inputs. So this one is a little bit different than the previous in that the grid layout is going to be in place of those 2 block box layouts. So we're doing all the same stuff in the main that we did in the previous. We've got all the same stuff in the create GUI, except instead of having a setup fields and setup labels method, I've got setup labels and fields. So let's look at that one. This is where I'm going to use my grid layout. So I've got my submit panel here, which should probably be inputs panel, but whatever, it's just fine. It's called submit panel, and then I've got something called inputs here, and I've got a grid layout, and the constructor says 5 and 2. That means it's going to have 5 rows and 2 columns. If I look at this, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 by 2. 2 columns wide, 5 columns high. I'm going to create all of my labels, and I'm also going to do something called set horizontal alignment. This is going to allow me to align those the content in those labels, center, left, right, or whatever. I've chosen swing constant center to align all those, the text and those labels to the center, so that they correspond with these fields just a little bit better. So I'm creating all my labels, setting all their alignments to center. I create all my fields, set them all to 12. And now I've got to add things. Now look at the order in which I add them. Field label, or F name label, F name field. L name label, L name field. Age label, age field. There's no mistake here. I added them in this order because as I add them with the grid layout, it's going to add them to that grid layout in that order. So you'll see that F name label and then F name field. And then L name label and then L name field. The way it adds them, it goes cell by cell, row by row. So first row, it goes cell 0, cell 1. Second row, cell 0, cell 1. Third row, cell 0, cell 1. Fourth, 0, 1. Fifth, 0, 1. And that's how it's going to add them in that order. If I just did all the labels first and all the fields first, it would go label, 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 field, 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 field. And everything would be mixed up and it would look bad. So you have to be careful in the way in which you add things to your grid layout. So I added all those things to my panel, and then I add that panel to the west. All right, everything else in this file is exactly like the other one. The only thing is I have one fewer panel, and I've got the grid layout arranging all those fields and labels. So as you can see, there are a couple of different ways to use multiple layouts in the same file. The big thing that you have to think about with this is, before you actually write your code, you want to kind of plan out what your GUI is going to look like in advance. And for every area that you want to break up into some sort of an arrangement, you've got to make sure that that has its own panel. In other words, if I want this section here to be a grid and I want these sections just to have one individual thing, then this has to have a panel of its own, and that has to be broken up into a grid with all of its components added to it. And then I just add the button and the area and the label to the other sections. Remember, a border layout can only have one thing added to each of its zones. I can't add 10 things to the west. So I have to put all those things in the west on their own panel, give it its own layout manager, and then add that panel to the west. All right, I hope that this was a helpful video. And in the next couple videos, we're going to talk about using the listeners, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit more depth. Thanks for watching.